Well, hey there, friendships. Welcome back to Curtis' Corner. If you're new here, hi, I'm Curtis. This is my corner, and on today's Film Friday, we are going to be discussing horror movies of the 90s. Now, this is going to be a two-part series just because there are so many films that came out in the 90s that are horror. And I want to give not such a long video because there are over 30 that I'm going to be talking about. So we're going to do a part one, which is this one, and then a part two. So in part one, I'm going to be discussing films from 1990 to 1994. And then in part two, I will be discussing from 1995 to 1999. This video has 13 different films that I'm going to be talking about and ranking by my own personal preference, as I've done with my last two videos within this kind of decade series that I've been doing. And then part two will have a top 18. So if you're interested in seeing my opinions on the films of the 90s, then keep on watching. Now, disclaimer, this is strictly just my opinion. Feel free not to agree with it. Everyone has their own opinions. This is just my preference based off of the films that I've seen. So as I said, there are over 30, specifically like 31. And while I could have ranked them for the entire decade, I did split it up into a few. And the reason being because I just didn't want the videos to be too long. Now, that doesn't mean that the number one film in this part is the number one film out of all the 90s, and that also doesn't mean in the second video that the number one film of that one is the number one film of all the 90s either. I just ranked it as my favorite for these first five, and then the second 5 years of this decade. But if you would like me to do kind of like a top 10 90s horror, then like this video, and I will gladly give you a top 10 films of the 90s that I personally love myself, and see if you agree on my ranking of just the top 10 out of the entire decade. So, in the 13th spot is the film Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, I knew the show. I had zero idea that this started off as a film. When I found out about it, it was only because I ended up getting a Blu-ray of Buffy and Jennifer's Body, which doesn't seem to be like they would go together at all. But I digress. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie, sucks. It's honestly, it's so bad. It's so cheesy. The show is cheesy, but it has its good dark moments. This movie has zero dark moments. It's not scary. It's very, very laughable. The acting is very subpar. The action sequences are just kind of meh. It's not really a likable movie, and that is why it's at the very bottom of my list. In spot number 12, I have Alien 3. This one had its moments. It showed promise. It just didn't deliver on all the notes that it could have. I can see the direction of where they were going, but the moment that they really brought in the CGI of the alien is where it kind of killed it, because it just basically made you get taken out of the film when you saw it kind of moving around and chasing all the people in the film. The second Alien film is going to definitely be like top tier. You want to meet that, and this one fell extremely short on that aspect, and the storyline wasn't really even that strong to kind of hold together the film length. It like barely just passed. But again, also acting is okay. The best actor in the entire film would be Sigourney Weaver. In spot number 11 is Gremlins 2, The New Batch. This one, while I enjoy it, and I do watch it from time to time, it is not as good as the first one. I find there's so much more story-wise within the first one. I find the effects and the puppeteering of the Gremlins is a whole lot better looking in the first one than it is in the second. They definitely went more campy and more humorous in the second one, and less dark and scary as the first one was trying to be, as funny as that also is. But it still was able to generate enough of a love for the film that they are actually doing a sequel, which I will be going to see. I just hope that they do kind of stick to the practical effects of the Gremlins rather than doing like a CGI thing. I don't want them to go to the CGI route. Just because we have the technology does not mean that we should use said technology. Don't ruin things that are already good. I just think that this film could have had a better storyline than what it did, but it's not a terrible sequel just at all. Spot number 10 of this half of the decade is Silence of the Lambs. While I do enjoy this film, it is very, very much a slow burn type of movie, and there's not really any scary moments in it. If you're not in the mood to watch almost like a documentary paced film, then you're not going to enjoy this movie at all. There are definitely creepy elements within the film. However, it is still not going to be like a scary film that's going to like play with your head or anything. It's very much a detective interviewing another serial killer to find a serial killer. That's all it is. As iconic as Anthony Hopkins is in the role of Hannibal Lecter, it's still just not a scary movie. And I feel like with its sequels, while each one kind of did progressively worse as the series went on, I found they brought more of the horror elements into the sequels than they did with this one. And that's just, I haven't even seen all the sequels, but that's just based on the clips of said films that I have seen. This one, like I said, story is great, but it's very much a slow burn. And if you're not into a slow burn type of movie that doesn't have any like real scare factors, except for maybe a little bit near the end, you're gonna pretty much find that this movie is just super boring. Number 9 is Candyman. I don't remember too much about this because I was, I don't even know, I was in my teens. I would say probably 15. So about 15 years ago is when I saw this. Maybe 14 years ago. And I remember being freaked out by it, but at the same time, I remember thinking it was just kind of meh. I think I was just too young to watch it and really understand what the story was giving. The scary elements that were in there were good. Clearly, as I said, I was scared of the film a little bit. I don't think it was enough to traumatize me. There are films that have traumatized me, and not to the point where like I'm super affected years later from them, but to the point where I've actually like enjoyed myself watching them and would want to rewatch the film again, just knowing how much it scared me. This one I have yet to rewatch. I do want to rewatch it just now that I can probably fully grasp and understand the storyline of this film, but for what it was at the time that I saw it, I thought it was okay. I didn't think it was phenomenal. I didn't think it was groundbreaking, but it is definitely much better than the past films on this list. Number 8 is Leprechaun. This film holds a soft spot for me. I know I've placed it a little bit lower on this list, but that's because it is a very laughable film. It does have its creepy elements to it. The Leprechaun is just, it's the same way as Chucky in the Child's Play series. You see this tiny little creature running around going after people and you laugh, because a lot of the times when you're showing like a smaller entity, whether it be a leprechaun or a doll or just something humanoid but small, and they just zoom in on the little tiny feet just going boop, 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 you're gonna laugh. It's a funny movie, and just the responses that the leprechaun makes and his little quips are just, it makes it so much more of an enjoyable film. And the effects, like the practical effects that they use still can hold up to today, and I just think it's a well done film. The storyline could be obviously improved upon, but for the early 90s, it is still a really enjoyable film, and the acting is decent enough to still kind of hold up to today's standards. Speaking of Child's Play, number 7 is Child's Play 3. This was my least favorite Child's Play film. The storyline seemed kind of lost. The acting was okay. I don't like that they replaced The main character who portrayed Andy, I get why they did it. I still don't like it. The friendship between Andy and the other kid in like boarding school or wherever he was definitely seemed forced. It didn't seem like it came across as natural. I will say the ending action sequence on like, what is it, the junkyard? I think it was in like a junkyard. I think that was a good sequence. The quips that Chucky gave weren't as good as the past quips that he's given in the past 2 films. So it was definitely a letdown in the series, but it was still obviously a popular enough series that they continued on with 4 more films and then a TV series. So you're doing something right. This film was just, it just wasn't it for me. Number 6 is the film Misery. This is another Stephen King adaptation. This one stars Kathy Bates as Annie Wilkes. This film I have watched probably 3 or 4 times. I love this film. The one scene that makes me cringe is the hobbling scene where, what's his name? The main guy in this film. He's like laying in bed because he got into a car accident, and she's basically like his savior, but he wants to leave, and then she's like, you ain't leaving until you write a new book. And then she like takes a sledgehammer and like breaks his ankles with like a wooden block in between. Woof! The practical effects on that are so realistic that it's super yucky. It makes me cringe every single time that I watch it. Another iteration of Annie Wilkes, I will say, is in season 2 of Castle Rock. I do hope that they make a season 3 because one of my favorite shows. But this, I loved the adaptation of Misery. I thought it was super good. I thought the acting was phenomenal. It still holds up to today. The effects still hold up today. And just every scene that plays out just keeps you on edge once you find out kind of how crazy Kathy Bates' character of Annie really is. She is a wonderful actress who portrays this character to perfection. Number 5 is Interview with a Vampire. This is another extremely slow burn. I would say even slower than Silence of the Lambs. However, there are definitely more horror elements I find in this one. While it's more of a love story, I do find that there's more horror elements in this, which allow for a better storytelling experience and allow for a better paced slow burn. While it's not a scary film, the horror elements do keep you enthralled and enticed into the film, and it allows me to keep my focus a bit more on it, I find. And the acting is it's wonderful. Brad Pitt's acting, terrific. Tom Cruise, one of my favorite actors in this film, nails the role of Lestat perfectly, and I'm really sad that they recast him in Queen of the Damned. But this is basically the defining moment of both Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, and also Kirsten Dunst. As a child actor, she excelled in this role, and it was phenomenal watching her evolve throughout this film as her character kind of evolves and changes, and just so much character development for all 3 of these main characters in this film, and I loved every single moment of it. Number 4 is one of my all-time favorites, Dracula, with Keanu Reeves and Anthony Hopkins and Gary Oldman. Gary Oldman's portrayal of Dracula and just the whole portrayal of Dracula itself was fantastic. I love that he had different costumes. I love that he had different forms, both old and young, how deceptive he was, how alluring he was, how romanticized his relationships with women were. The storytelling aspect of this was phenomenal. It kept every ounce of my attention on this film, and I have watched this movie at least 5 times. It is so good. I will say Keanu Reeves' British accent is not the greatest. However, the set pieces, the costume designing, like I said, the acting, for the most part, aside from Keanu Reeves, absolutely fantastic. And it shows how fantastic it is by how well this film holds up to today's standards. You could remake this film and it will probably not be as good as this version is. It is phenomenally done, and it like I said, it holds such a strong point in time where no matter what decade we're in, it will still hold up to that decade. Number 3 is Jurassic Park. Now, you might be thinking, why is Jurassic Park on your list? Same reason why Beetlejuice was. It's horror elements, okay? You're being chased by giant creatures. I consider monster movies, so dinosaurs are technically monsters in a way. Monsters, whether it be a strictly action film or strictly horror, it has horror elements because 25, 30 foot plus tall creatures are terrifying. And if you saw a dinosaur, whether it be a plant eater or not, you're going to be terrified because you're like, holy mother of God, this is a giant creature that's never been here before. So, and then on top of that, you have like T-Rexes and raptors coming after you. That's terrifying. So I'm classifying this as a type of horror. This film, practical effects all the way around. Phenomenal. You cannot tell me that that does not look real. These dinosaurs are real. I don't care if they're actually robots. These dinosaurs are real and are chasing these people, okay? I know in Jurassic World, they're all basically CGI. This is all practical effects, for the most part. I know there's some in the distant, at the opening scenes where you're first ever seeing the dinosaurs in the distance that is CGI, and all the close-up dinosaurs that all the humans interact with are practical effects, robotics, animatronics, so on and so forth. It is phenomenally done and like to perfection, to the point where even now you look back at it and that's a real dinosaur. There's no way that you can detect that that is false, aside from the fact that we know dinosaurs don't exist. That's the only way that you know. The acting is fantastic in this film. The action sequences are fantastic in this film. There's not really any bad things I have to say about this. If you can think of any bad things, leave them in the comments below. Spot number 2 is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I really enjoy this one. Not only did it flip the entire franchise on its head, but the acting about acting is a great, not twist, but different outlook on this film. The fact that they made Freddy Krueger a separate entity and not like a character is a fantastic twist. And the fact that they had to bring back the actors from the original movie to portray themselves again, but in the real world. So not only were they playing like a characterized version of themselves, but they had to replay the character that they were in the first film in order to kind of beat Freddy Krueger, who is now this like demonic entity that's living in the real world. And like Robert Englund reprises his role as Freddy Krueger, but he also plays himself at the same time. And like Wes Craven directed this film, but also stars in the film as the director, Wes Craven. I think storyline, it could have maybe been a little bit better, but otherwise, for the most part, it is such a good storyline. The practical effects that they use in this are so wonderful to see. How gruesome they went with it. It was basically bringing it right back to the roots, making it back to be very dark and gritty again. Less comedy as it went on through the franchise. This one brought it right back down to ground zero of just, let's do straight up horror, few quips here and there because that's who Freddy is. But for the most part, it was just a very scary film and made you on edge of what could happen to these characters because now it's real. And finally, in my last spot, number 1 for this half of the decade is Child's Play 2. This is one of my absolute favorite films. The acting, fantastic. The quips that Chucky does, phenomenal. The set pieces, the action sequences, all fantastically well done. My favorite scene is when Chucky is chasing Andy and Kyle through the toy factory, and he seems to almost be able to trip them up and get the upper hand when it's just basically going to just flip, because that's how all these films go, is where he's going to be seemingly getting the upper hand and winning, and then it flips to show that it's actually the protagonists, Andy and Kyle in this case, who will be getting the upper hand on him. But that whole film, I think, was just peak Chucky. And it had its highs and lows within the series, obviously, but this one is definitely, I think, the highest that Chucky could have ever been. That is my ranking for the first half of the 90s. Stay tuned for next week's video where I will be talking about the latter half of the year and what films came out then, as well as ranking them according to my personal preferences and what I thought was my favorite in that section of the 90s. So like I said, if you do want a full decade top 10 of my favorite horror films of the 90s, give this video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel because I put out weekly videos, and hit that notification bell so you know when I post a brand new video, because if you don't, how else are you going to know when I post? You won't, so do it. I will see you on Monday with a brand new first impressions for a makeup palette, and next week for part 2 of the 90s horror ranking. But until then, goodbye, friendships.